The crimson glow of the studio lights wrapped the stage in a warmth that usually promised joy. The Graham Norton Show had built its reputation on charm and laughter, a velvet soft stage where wit danced freely and guests surrendered themselves to playful banter. Tonight was no exception, at least at first glance. The audience buzzed, their anticipation vibrating like a live current through the air. They expected what they always expected, a safe collision of comedy and charisma, a performance polished smooth by years of tradition. Ryan Reynolds entered with his trademark swagger, the sly grin that seemed to make an entire room lean forward. Applause thundered. Graham, perched confidently in his chair, greeted him with that familiar twinkle in his eye, the knowing smirk of a man who has navigated hundreds of egos with effortless control. The conversation began lightly, as expected, with jokes about superheroes and self-deprecating quips that Reynolds deployed like arrows hitting their target. But beneath the surface something flickered, a tension almost invisible to the casual eye. The pauses were a second too long, the smiles a shade too tight. When Graham leaned in, his questions carried an edge, subtle at first, a playful poke, the kind of prodding that normally loosens stars into confession, yet tonight, the poke landed harder. The audience laughed on cue, but Reynolds' eyes betrayed him. His posture stiffened, the quicksilver charm dimming. He laughed, but it was hollow, a laugh that came from obligation rather than amusement. Graham sensed it and pressed forward, perhaps believing he could crack through the veneer. That was his craft after all, to turn discomfort into entertainment. "You've always made a career out of joking about yourself," Graham said lightly, leaning back in his chair. "But tell me, when the cameras are off, when you're home with Blake and the kids, are you still Ryan Reynolds the comedian, or does the mask ever slip?" The crowd chuckled, ready for another quip, but Reynolds didn't deliver one. He froze, his smile faltering into something raw. The silence that followed was thick, stretching into seconds that felt like minutes. Reynolds finally leaned forward, his voice lower, quieter, but edged with steel. "You think it's all a game," he murmured, the words not rehearsed, not polished, but piercing in their simplicity. The room shifted instantly. Laughter stopped mid-breath. The audience, sensing the rupture, glanced nervously at one another. Was this still comedy? Or had they just witnessed the beginning of something else entirely? Graham's lips curved into a smile, but it was forced, brittle around the edges. His hand gripped the arm of his chair, knuckles whitening ever so slightly. "Well, it is a talk show," he said, trying to diffuse the weight with levity. But Reynolds didn't yield. His stare cut through the stage lights, heavy with a defiance that felt uncharacteristic, almost dangerous. The power dynamics shifted in that moment. For once, Graham was not the conductor of charm, but a man standing trial under the gaze of his own guest. The audience shuffled uncomfortably, some still chuckling nervously, others dead silent, as though they were suddenly spectators in a courtroom where judgment was imminent. What was supposed to be a carefully scripted dance of humor had fractured into something raw, unscripted, and utterly real. And then it happened. Reynolds rose from his chair. The scrape of metal against the studio floor echoed louder than applause. His body language was clear. This was not a dramatic pause, not a staged bit for the cameras. It was rejection. It was defiance. It was verdict. For the first time in the history of the show, laughter had not won. Instead, silence reigned. Heavy, awkward, unforgettable. Graham, momentarily stripped of his authority, sat frozen. The cameras rolled mercilessly, capturing every twitch of expression, every ounce of tension. Ryan Reynolds didn't look back. His departure wasn't merely an exit. It was a rupture, a tearing open of the glossy facade that had defined talk show culture for decades. And in that single act of standing, walking, and leaving, the world saw something far more dramatic than any scripted moment. A battle line drawn between performance and truth. The rupture had already begun, though no one realized it at the start. When Ryan Reynolds sat down under the amber studio lights, the expectation was effortless banter, the rhythm of wit he had perfected over decades. He was the guest every host loved, sharp enough to keep things alive, humble enough to let others shine. But tonight, beneath the polished humor, cracks were already forming. Graham Norton thrived on charm weaponized as theater. His genius was to peel back a celebrity's carefully constructed facade, to coax them into vulnerability while audiences roared. It was disarming, never cruel, at least not in perception. Yet there was always an undercurrent. To laugh with Graham was also, in part, to laugh at yourself. Most stars surrendered. Reynolds, however, carried an unspoken contract. He would laugh, he would play, but there were limits. The interview began as expected. Graham rolled a clip from Deadpool, the crowd erupting at the outrageous antics on screen. Reynolds chuckled along, throwing in a sly jab at his own expense. "That's me at my most dignified," he quipped, and the audience roared. It was the well-oiled performance everyone had come to see. But Graham shifted. He leaned forward, a glimmer in his eyes. "You and Blake, you two make marriage look like a comedy sketch sometimes. Does she ever tire of the jokes? Or do the kids just roll their eyes?" Reynolds's smile twitched. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it revealed everything. He replied softly, measured, "Careful." The audience laughed, assuming it was part of the act, but the cadence was different. It wasn't the quick jab of humor. It was a warning disguised in wit. Graham pressed. "Oh, come on. You've built a brand on letting us peek into your marriage. Those Twitter back and forths, the way you both tease each other, it's practically public property now." The words cut sharper than intended. Public property. Reynolds's jaw tightened, his fingers lacing together in his lap. He forced a chuckle, but the air in the studio thickened. "Some things," he said, his voice quieter, "aren't a performance." The silence that followed was almost imperceptible to a casual viewer at home, but in the studio, it hung heavy. The laughter died mid-breath. People shifted in their seats. For years, Graham had walked this line with effortless grace, never losing the crowd, never losing control. But this moment was different. The tension wasn't about marriage jokes or parenting anecdotes. It was about control, about who dictated the story. Reynolds had always been generous in playing the fool, but on his terms. Every self-deprecating quip was calculated, a shield as much as a performance. To Graham, that shield was a wall meant to be dismantled. To Reynolds, it was the line that kept his private life safe. He leaned back, forcing a smile, though his eyes betrayed the fatigue beneath it. "I know what you're trying to do," he murmured, "but not everything is content. Some things stay mine." The audience gasped softly, a ripple of realization spreading like a wave. The conversation was no longer banter, it was cross-examination. Graham's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. He tried to smooth it over, to disguise discomfort with a chuckle. "Oh, Ryan, don't be so serious. We're just having a laugh." But the balance of power had shifted. For once, the master of playful intrusion had encountered resistance not cloaked in humor, but delivered with quiet steel. The show carried on, but the rhythm was broken. Every subsequent question was measured, cautious. The audience sensed it, that something had snapped beneath the velvet surface. What was once a safe, comedic stage had turned into a courtroom of sorts, with each word, each silence, weighted like evidence. And in that fragile space, the fault lines beneath the banter spread wider, threatening to break open entirely. The air inside the studio had shifted. The crimson lights no longer glowed with warmth. They seemed to burn hotter, exposing every twitch of expression. The audience, once a sea of laughter and ease, now sat on the fault line of something dangerous. They weren't merely spectators anymore. They had become a gallery, a jury box, waiting for cues on whether to laugh, gasp, or remain silent. It was subtle at first, laughter arriving a second too late, applause tapering into uneasy quiet. The people who had come expecting a comedy spectacle now sensed they were witnessing something unplanned, something unscripted. They looked to Graham Norton, the trusted conductor of levity, for reassurance, but even he was faltering. His smile, usually liquid gold, looked forced, his timing slightly off. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Do you always find a way to make someone the butt of the joke?" The words landed like a gavel striking wood. The audience froze. A nervous titter broke out in the back row but quickly died, smothered by the weight of the moment. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker across Graham's face. The faint smirk that trembled into stiffness, the quick dart of his eyes toward the producers offstage. For the first time, he looked unsettled, even cornered. Graham cleared his throat, reaching for the familiar rhythm of wit. "Well, Ryan, it's a talk show. We tell stories, we laugh, we play. Isn't that the point?" But Reynolds didn't. It let go. He locked eyes with the host, his tone sharper, stripped of its usual self-deprecating cushion. "There's a difference between playing and prying. You might not see it, but I do." The crowd collectively inhaled, the sound sharp as a gasp in a courtroom when evidence is revealed. Suddenly, they weren't clapping on cue. They were waiting, hanging on words, studying body language, passing tone like jurors deciding guilt or innocence. One woman in the front row clutched her handbag tighter, her face etched with discomfort. A man 3 seats down shifted restlessly, caught between the urge to laugh and the sense that laughter would be betrayal. Even the applause signs above the stage seemed dimmer, less commanding than usual. Every movement now carried double meaning. Graham's hand drumming lightly on the armrest looked like nervous tapping. Reynolds' posture, rigid and upright, felt like testimony under oath. The space between them was no longer a couch and a desk. It was a witness stand and a bench, and in that tension, the audience's role transformed completely. They were no longer a crowd entertained by 2 men sparring with charm. They were witnesses, jurors, participants in a cultural reckoning playing out live. The cameras panned to capture reaction shots. Wide eyes, tight smiles, lips pressed shut. These images, spliced later across social media, would tell their own story. That the night comedy became confrontation, the crowd knew it. They felt it in their bones. Graham attempted once more to seize control, chuckling nervously. "You know, Ryan, I tease because I like you. If I didn't, I wouldn't bother." But the audience didn't laugh with him. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of studio lights. The joke, once a reliable weapon, had fallen flat. Reynolds tilted his head, his expression unreadable. He let the silence stretch, unafraid. "Sometimes," he said softly. "Liking someone means respecting their boundaries." It was quiet, almost too quiet, yet those words cracked louder than thunder. The jury, the audience, had heard both sides, and though no verdict was spoken, the weight of judgment pressed heavy in the room. The balance of power was no longer certain. The show was no longer a performance. It was a trial. The air between them had thickened into something unmovable, like glass about to shatter. Ryan Reynolds sat back, his arms folded across his chest, the familiar glimmer of boyish charm gone. In its place was a steady calm, the kind that comes before a storm. His reputation had always been built on performance. The trickster, the quick-witted rogue, the man who could disarm with a smile. But beneath that persona was precision. Every joke, every anecdote was a choice. Control was his craft, his weapon. Graham Norton's weapon was disruption. For decades he had mastered the art of pushing, needling, coaxing, and ultimately cracking the protective shells of the famous. He prided himself on being the man who could turn a carefully manicured celebrity into something real, raw, and entertaining. Tonight, though, his usual tools felt blunt. "Ryan," Graham said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "people adore you for being open. That's what makes you relatable. If you hide behind walls, doesn't that spoil the fun?" The question lingered in the air, coated in sugar but sharpened like a blade. The audience murmured uneasily, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. Reynolds' jaw flexed, his voice steady. "There's a difference between being open and being stripped bare. I share what I choose. That's honesty. Anything else is intrusion." A smattering of applause broke out from somewhere in the back, hesitant, quickly stifled. Graham's smile tightened further. He was losing ground, and he knew it. He leaned forward, raising an eyebrow in mock curiosity. "So, no stories about your kids? No funny family tales? Not even one for us tonight?" The line was delivered with trademark wit, but the timing was wrong. Reynolds didn't smile. He didn't flinch. His response came quick, sharp as a blade. "That's not funny." The silence that followed was cavernous. The audience sat frozen, breaths caught, eyes wide. The phrase wasn't playful. It wasn't part of the bit. It was rejection, plain and unapologetic. Graham blinked, momentarily at a loss. For years, he had been the puppeteer, pulling strings with charm and laughter. Now the puppet had cut the cords. The cameras zoomed in on Reynolds' face, catching the storm brewing behind his eyes. He wasn't angry in the traditional sense. He was resolute, defiant. The clash wasn't just between two men. It was between two ideologies. One believed entertainment justified intrusion. The other believed dignity was non-negotiable. The audience, now fully transformed into jurors, leaned forward. Every whisper, every rustle of fabric against the red seats echoed like thunder in the silence. The set, normally a playground of laughter, had become a battleground of values. Graham forced a chuckle, trying to steer the conversation back. "Well, forgive me. You're usually such a good sport. I suppose I misjudged the moment." Reynolds leaned closer, his voice low but carrying across the room. "You didn't misjudge the moment. You misjudged me." The words landed heavy, final. The clash of personas was complete. The host who thrived on disarming charm had collided head-on with the actor who refused to yield. In that collision, something irreversible had happened. The laughter that once filled the room had been replaced by silence, pregnant with consequence. The audience wasn't entertained. They were witnessing a showdown, one that felt less like television and more like testimony under oath. And with each second that ticked by, the fault lines widened, threatening to rupture into a spectacle no one could contain. Had begun as a playful interview now felt like a trial, and Ryan Reynolds sat at its center, not as a jester, but as a man defending something sacred. His smile had vanished, replaced with a stillness that spoke louder than any joke. For years, Reynolds had mastered the art of revealing just enough. A witty anecdote here, a playful jab at his wife there, carefully curated glimpses into his personal world. Fans adored it, critics praised it, and Graham Norton Show had benefited from it many times before. But those fragments had always been deliberate. They were a dance, not an invitation. Tonight, Graham had pressed past the choreography. Stumbling into territory Reynolds kept guarded with near-religious devotion. His family. Graham, sensing the resistance, leaned forward with that trademark glimmer, his voice lilting as though coaxing a reluctant guest at a dinner party. "But surely you've got one story, just one. Come on, Ryan, the world loves hearing about how you and Blake juggle life at home. It's charming." Reynolds' eyes darkened, his lips tightening into a thin line. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but edged with unmistakable defiance. "You don't get to play with that. Not everything is content." The silence that followed was palpable, heavy, almost accusatory. The audience froze, some glancing at each other with wide eyes, others staring fixedly at the stage as though afraid to miss a single flicker of expression. Graham chuckled nervously, trying to brush it off. "Oh, but you've made jokes about it before, haven't you? Those little Twitter exchanges." Reynolds cut him off, sharper this time. "Those were mine to give, my choice. This isn't." The words cracked through the room like thunder. The line was clear now, drawn thick and undeniable. What Graham had framed as lighthearted banter was, in Reynolds' eyes, a trespass. The cameras lingered, catching the tension etched into every line of Reynolds' face. He wasn't simply annoyed, he was protective, fierce in a way that startled those who knew him only as the ever-smiling, ever-joking star. The man who had spent years parodying himself was now defending the one thing he refused to parody: his wife, his daughters, his home. The audience felt the weight of it too. They understood, perhaps more than they expected to. In an age where privacy was currency and exposure was entertainment, here was a man refusing to barter with the most intimate parts of his life. A murmur rippled faintly through the crowd, not laughter, but something closer to agreement. It was subtle, but Graham caught it, and his smirk faltered. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice softer now, almost weary. "People think because you see us on screen, because you laugh at the jokes, that you own every piece of us. But my kids didn't sign up for this. Blake didn't either. They're not here to be content. They're my life." It was no longer a performance. It was testimony. The audience sat hushed, rapt, as if a sacred truth had been spoken aloud. Graham, usually so quick with a quip, found himself with none. His eyes darted toward the crowd, searching for laughter to rescue him, but there was none. Only silence, and the sound of Reynolds reclaiming his boundaries in front of millions. The stakes were no longer about a television segment gone wrong. They were about dignity, protection, and the refusal to let spectacle consume what mattered most. And in that declaration, the trial reached deeper than anyone expected. This was no longer about jokes. It was about survival in a world that demanded too much. The studio air had grown dense, every breath thick with unease. The laughter that once danced so freely in the crimson-lit space had all but vanished, replaced by a silence that crackled with tension. Ryan Reynolds sat firm, shoulders squared, his presence radiating a quiet storm. Across from him, Graham Norton clung to his familiar tools: humor, charm, irony, though each one now slipped like water through his fingers. For a brief moment, Graham chuckled, waving a hand as though brushing away the weight that had settled between them. "Oh, Ryan, you're taking this far too seriously. We're here to entertain, that's all." But Reynolds didn't smile, his eyes fixed on Graham with unflinching resolve. "No," he said, his tone deliberate, sharp, immovable. "This isn't entertainment. Not for me." The audience gasped softly, a ripple moving through the rows like a shiver. It wasn't anger they heard in his voice, but conviction, the kind that comes when a man refuses to yield. Graham shifted in his chair, his grin tightening, lines of discomfort creeping across his face. He leaned in, still trying to steer the interview back to safer waters. "Come now, you've made a career of laughing at yourself. Surely you can take a little more ribbing tonight." Reynolds' arms folded tighter across his chest, his voice low but resonant. "I laugh at myself because I choose to. That's mine. But when you push into places I've never offered, that's not comedy. That's taking." The words struck like iron, reverberating through the studio. The audience, caught between loyalty to their beloved host and empathy for Reynolds, now sat frozen, unsure whose side to embrace. Their silence was no longer passive, it was judgment, weighing heavily in the air. Graham exhaled sharply, raising an eyebrow in a show of defiance. "If I've crossed a line, it wasn't intentional. But surely you know how this works. Why? You're here because people want to see the real you." Reynolds leaned forward, the intensity in his gaze cutting through the lights and cameras. "This is the real me. The man who knows where his lines are, and who won't let anyone, even you, erase them." The clash had escalated into a duel, not of fists, but of philosophies. Graham wielded levity like a shield, throwing out quips in hopes of softening the mood. Reynolds answered with steel, each word stripped of artifice, each phrase building walls no laughter could climb. The crowd shifted restlessly. A woman in the second row pressed her lips together, shaking her head slightly. Another, further back, whispered something to her neighbor, her eyes wide. Every reaction became part of the scene, evidence for or against, as though the very air was holding its breath for a verdict. Graham's voice hardened now, a touch defensive beneath the charm. "So what, Ryan? We just avoid everything real? Just let you promote your film and move on?" Reynolds straightened, his chin lifted. "No. We talk about the work. We talk about what I bring here willingly. But my family, my children, they are not your punchline. Not tonight. Not ever." The firmness of his words landed with finality, reverberating through the silent crowd. Graham's practiced composure flickered, the smile stretched too thin, betraying the first signs of defeat. Every gesture, every look, had become symbolic. Graham's laugh, now hollow, felt like deflection. Reynolds' silence between answers, deliberate, heavy, was refusal. The show no longer followed its usual rhythm. It had become a duel in slow motion, where every word was another strike, every pause another tightening of the noose. The spiral was complete. What began as playful banter had collapsed into open confrontation, with neither man retreating, neither man yielding ground. The audience knew it. They weren't watching entertainment anymore. They were watching history fracture before their eyes. The Graham Norton Show was built on rhythm. There was a formula as old as its crimson couch. Set up the goo,